Hello and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Patrick Donegan. I'm Principal Analyst and founder of HardenStance, a cybersecurity analyst firm with some amount of specialization in the telecom sector. If you were to go to HardenStance.com, you would find a small treasure trove of reports, webinars, etc., relating to cybersecurity and in particular a whole section dedicated to the telecom sector. I'm joined for today's webinar by Peter Haig, Principal Technical Director for Telecoms for the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC, and by Jerry McQuaid, Director of Telecoms and Internet Security for Ofcom. Gentlemen, how are you both doing?
Good, thank you.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Patrick.
And we are also joined today by Nils Ahrlich. Nils is Head of Security Consulting for Nokia. Nokia are the exclusive sponsors of this webinar. Were it not for Nokia's commitment to contributing to the security of the telecom sector through its products and services, none of us would be here convened today to talk about it. So in that spirit, thank you very much indeed, Nokia. And thank you, Nils. How are you doing, Nils?
Hi, Patrick. Thanks for arranging this webinar. We are pleased to be here.
Great to have you. Okay, so let's look at the agenda that we're going to roll through. If we go to the next slide very quickly. So our UK colleagues are going to talk through the history and current status of the UK's Telecommunications Security Act and its objectives. I'm going to give you a regulatory update from around the world. We're going to have a four-way discussion around some of the key themes raised, and then I'm delighted to say we will open Q&A to you all. In fact, you can submit your Q&A, your questions anytime at all during the course of the webinar. We will store them up and we will look at them later on towards the end of the session. If we could go to the next slide, please. So before we get underway, one housekeeping message, the one I mentioned about submitting your questions. Here also is a bit of context. At Mobile World Congress last month, I remember to ask 14 of the individuals I met what they thought of the UK's Telecommunications Security Act and other comparable regulatory initiatives from around the world. Take a look at some of the answers that the various folks shared with me. They were typically at sort of VP or C-level executives in network security and cybersecurity vendors. I asked them whether they thought the regulations of this kind are good or bad for cybersecurity, or maybe whether they don't make any difference at all. Around half thought that such regulation will be good. A bit less than a third thought it will be bad, and a bit more than a fifth thought it will make no difference. Opinions ranged from some of the following: regulators don't understand their own mandates, it'll make no difference or make things worse, to regardless of regulations, I think telcos will go in this direction anyway, to ultimately it will be down to enforcement, but it's a fantastic thing in principle. And then lastly, the one I have to say resonates best with me is right at the very bottom there. It may not be the best way to do security, but it's the best way to secure budget. Therefore, it's positive. I have to say that for me, at any rate, is pretty much the clinching argument. These are some of the many perspectives that our first speakers today have had to navigate in pulling together before, during, and since the passage of the UK's Telecommunications Security Act. I'll leave Peter and Jerry to share with you how the UK arrived at its position and some of the hows and whys of how they got there. So, Peter and Jerry, over to you, fellas.
Thanks very much. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we should start by introducing our roles. Do you want to go first, Jerry, and introduce the role of Ofcom?
Fair enough. So Ofcom is the regulator for communications in the UK. My specific role is around telecommunications and internet security, and in this case, the Telecom Security Act. So we will monitor the compliance of the operators in the UK. And we work very closely with NCSC in particular and other government agencies to ensure that we are following the requirements that were set out, along with DCIT, what's now called DCIT, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology.
Yeah, and NCSC, we provide advice and guidance. We're the National Technical Authority in the UK for cybersecurity, and we provide advice and guidance to a range of government across the public sector, CNI, and to citizens in the UK. So we have quite a broad remit. My focus obviously on telecoms, and so our role in telecoms is to support the operators in improving the security of their networks. It's to help them as and when they have a breach, and to help them with that breach and managing it. Yeah, it's provide effectively to help them be as good as they can be in security. And we also obviously provide advice to Ofcom, and we provide advice into government on the security of telecoms networks in the UK, and try and give everyone an insight into the threat. Okay, next slide. So I thought I'd start by looking at sort of where we are with telecoms and cybersecurity. So telecoms has a really challenging position when you look at what it's trying to achieve. I've been in Cyber UK this week, which is our sort of flagship cybersecurity conference that's been running here in Belfast. And I was listening to a CISO earlier today. I won't name them because I don't know if they would mind it, but I was listening to a CISO earlier today, and they said that they get challenged often as to, you know, well, how much do we need to spend on cybersecurity? And their response to this was, well, the cost of cybersecurity is linked to how your attack surface, how many systems you've got exposed, and it's linked to the impact of having those systems compromised. And so the bigger your attack surface, the more money I'm going to need, is basically the way he put it. And I think that's really, really important when you think about telecoms. So telecoms has a uniquely challenging position in that it is the basis of our digital economies. So it needs to be really highly resilient. And, you know, lots of operators will look at their resilience requirements and treat them really, really very seriously. They also contain huge amounts of data. You know, think all of our data when we're using a telecoms network is running through their network, and also how we use their network is also contained as metadata within those networks. So they protect really highly valuable assets. So they need to be really robust. They need to look after some really sensitive assets, and at the same time, they have to connect everyone to everything, and that means they have to be highly connected. And so always telecoms networks have a significant attack surface. It's pretty unavoidable. And so, and there is actually a culture within telecoms as well that we build upon the last system that came out. You know, 2G, 3G built on 2G, 4G built on 3G and 2G, and 5G built on 4G, 3G and 2G, right? And alongside that, you have IMS systems and VoIP systems. You have often there's still circuit switch systems in there as well. You know, the variety of different systems that telecoms networks encompass mean that they are highly connected and with a very large attack surface. And so you look at that and you say, well, actually, they've got an incredibly challenging problem here in terms of their cybersecurity. And so you'd kind of expect them to be at the cutting edge of cyber in the, you know, when people talk about cybersecurity around the world, you'd expect maybe telcos would be the ones leading that conversation. And unfortunately, I think we all know that isn't often the case. That conversation isn't being led from the telecom sector. And part of the reason for that, to be honest, is because in the UK, certainly, we regulated the telecom sector heavily and made sure that there was high competition and prices were you know, effectively low. And I think that pushed out a lot of investment into things that were effectively overhead or seen as overhead, like cybersecurity. And so we've ended up with a telecom sector that hasn't kept pace, in my opinion, at least, with the cybersecurity ecosystem. The cybersecurity ecosystem is moving on, and I don't think telecoms has yet caught up. And so it's resulted in a cultural challenge that we've got now, where we've got telcos that really need to catch up. I'll come on to this in a second. There's a significant threat, and somehow we've got to help them catch up. And as governments, I think, you know, when we look at this problem, I think we're seeing that there isn't a lot of time. If we go to the next slide, please. So we started when really for the story for us started in 2018. And that's when, well, actually it started well before 2018, but in 2018, we started talking publicly about a massive Russian attack into UK telecoms. And actually it was global at the time, but we were focused particularly on the UK and a very large number of network infrastructure devices being compromised. And that, you know, obviously when these things happen, people then ask the question, well, how did this happen? And there are a variety of reasons reasons for that, which I'll come on to in a minute. But I think what's really key and what's really recognizable now is that when we spoke about it back in 2018, there were very few things publicly talking about telecoms, cyber incidents, telecom cyber attack. When you look at it today, and back then, when we were looking at building an evidence base for our legislation, there weren't that many public incidents that we could point at and say, well, these are really good examples of why cybersecurity regulation is needed. Whereas you look today, and I pulled up a list of 4 things there that I pulled off the internet, and that was when I was writing these slides in the last week. I found 4 different attacks that happened in the last week that were being talked about publicly. And I think there's been a real shift here in terms of the amount both that's happening and the amount that's being talked about publicly. Now, I put that graph up there. I will really flag it is very unscientific. Okay, this is effectively my team. When they see something, they put it on a distro for us all to see so that we all keep up to date with what people are saying in telecom security. And it's just ramping up the number of things that we're posting on there just because it's being reported more. There's more conversation and probably more targeting of telecoms. And so it is a growing threat. We've got our threat assessments that say telecoms are being increasingly attacked. And that it is something that I think as an industry, we have to be really concerned about, that our telcos, which are, like I said, the underpin for a digital economy, are being increasingly attacked by threat actors. Okay, go to the next slide, please. So what's happened in the UK around this? So I said, for us, the start of the story was talking about that large-scale attack that we had in 2018, or pre-2018. During 2018, the DCMS, which has now become DCIT in the UK, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, now it's the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, they commissioned a review into the supply chain in the telecom sector and what are the risks there. And as part of that review, we looked at the risks, we supported DCMS in that, and we looked at the risks. But one of the key things we did is said, well, the supply chain is not the only risk in telecoms here. There is a broader cybersecurity risk that you need to be concerned about. And that ultimately then kicked off a piece of work within government to say, well, okay, we've got something more than supply chain we need to look at. What are we doing here? As part of that work, we did a really extensive threat analysis. So obviously, when you say to a minister, we have a cybersecurity risk in the UK in the telecom sector, the next question is, okay, well, how bad is that risk and what are you going to do about it? And so we ended up doing a considerable amount of work over multiple years, looking at the threats to the telecom sector, looking at the risks to the telecom sector. I don't know if any of you have tried to do attack trees for an entire sector. It took a long time. It was a lot of work. And I am very proud, actually, of the work that we did. We're now in the process of renewing it, but it was considerable effort. And then as a result of that, we said, okay, well, of these, which are the most significant attacks, which are the most significant ways in which a telco could be compromised? And we wrote mitigations down for that. And that was the basis on which a Telecom Security Act was put together, which arrived in our UK Parliament in 2020 and became an act, passed through Parliament by November 2021. Jerry's going to talk in a minute about how the Act is structured, but then, the real detail of what that Act was asking operators to do had been shared well in advance of 2021, actually, but it only became a formal document in December 2022. And then we've had increasingly, throughout this time, we've been not just looking at this as a sort of a stick, as a legislative mechanism, we're looking at ways we can help operators in the UK be better at security. And so we've had a number of services as NCSC that we offer operators for free to say, well, this will help you, in our opinion, do your security better. But we're also building a UK telecoms lab to look specifically at the security of network equipment. Okay, next slide, please. I'll hand to Jerry here.
Yes, thank you, Pete. So, as you can see, there are a number of building blocks, I guess, for the telecom security framework. You will hear, people will use different phrases: TSA for Telecom Security Act, TSR, that generally refers to the code of practice. Those of us who've been around a long time, sometimes we refer to things in old money, but looking at the telecom security framework itself, we have the Telecom Security Act, the primary legislation, and then we have the regulations. So that's the secondary legislation. That is the mandatory items that operators must be able to comply with and evidence that to Ofcom. relatively straightforward. There are things in there many might be surprised to see because they look relatively simple and basic as such, but actually we have to write them in to be explicitly clear that they are actually baseline requirements and need to be. And the word baseline is deliberately chosen because that is what this is intended to achieve. It's intended to deliver a baseline level of security assurance across the UK operators. The next document then, which supplements that, is the code of practice. So if you were reading the regulations and you needed to understand how do I implement that in my network and what do I need to do, that is where the code of practice comes in. So it explains in quite clear language the intention behind each of the items, so the measures that we call them within the code of practice, and this is how the operators need to comply. The regulation is the mandatory item. The code of practice is the mechanism for delivery, so to speak. So it could be that an operator decides, I want to do something different for the code of practice. I'll deliver on that same objective or achieve the effect required using a different way. And they can do that, but it's recommended, obviously, that the code of practice is what's followed, but it may be that there are better solutions in place. And so what we don't want to do is constrain people or operators to what they need to do, because sometimes people come up with better solutions that exceed the baseline standard of assurance. So that is perfectly okay. It just takes a bit more time and effort on our part to understand what that is. We also have procedural guidance in dealing with the interaction with Ofcom specifically. So, and one thing that's often, I suppose, missed is the Telecom Security Act isn't just a confidentiality and integrity aspect of it. There's a resilience aspect here as well, and that is also included in our resilience guidance. It's different in terms of the code of practice, but there is a strong core resilience as thread through the framework itself. And sometimes resilience is not availability, if that makes sense. So it can be a choice of architecture or a choice of a business choice in terms of suppliers, etc. So that's worth bearing in mind. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of key concepts. I'm obviously not going to read out the code of practice, and that's for long summer evenings, but definitely you can see the headline items here and overarching key concepts that I suppose self-explanatory, but then it starts to get into some detail on the various items and network architecture, supply chain security. There's an important aspect there. Understanding what the supply chain is, understanding who the suppliers are, how resilient in terms of the support that they can provide, what type of measures they have in place to help the operators themselves. So it's really encouraging the operators to understand what the risks they inherit, so to speak. Monitoring and analysis, again, it is what it is, but there are a couple of pointers in there that start to ensure that nobody can forget item or miss anything, so to speak. Patching and updates, good guidance in there as well. Testing, the really important one, I'll come back to that one later. But all of these are combining in many ways to, it's not a statement of compliance, and that's something an operator will never get a certificate at the end of this to say you are compliant, well done. And jokingly, in some way that would be lovely to be able to do, but we just can't do it because the threat changes all the time. So what is good for today, a new vulnerability arises, a new technique comes up, a new threat actor has a different way of working. We have to ensure that the behaviors that are there are such that the operator is actually able to defend themselves and their customers effectively and appropriately. So that is one reason there is no certification, so to speak. There's a couple of quite key items as well that do cause some interesting conversations, I guess, with our operator colleagues. And they might be viewed as relatively new concepts, so to speak, but they're not new in other industries. So the defense industry, they would not be new. They in areas of security industry or safety critical industries, network separation. So managing the control plane effectively and securely is a key feature of this. There's quite a bit of work obviously being done on it, but these are things that it does highlight new ways of working, and of course that does flow down to the vendors themselves. There is, I suppose, an implicit aspect in we don't regulate the vendors in any way, shape, or form. We regulate the operators, but we do have to work with the ecosystem more generally. And then I use that phrase, that word very deliberately in terms of ecosystem. So what we want to ensure is that the operators, the vendors, dare I say it, the bodies who have a deep interest in this, and namely myself and Pete in some ways, we are all working together to be able to deliver on these effectively and for the future. Yeah, next slide, please. I mentioned network testing, and there is a specific I suppose program piece of work that we have with the operators called TBES. So it's a voluntary pen testing program that we do, but operators are now required by law to carry out regular testing to assess their security risk and make sure that's measured properly. We do this, the TBES program is one of the options that are there, so to speak. It is voluntary. We continue this, and we will continue this now that the Telecom Security Act is in place. But we expect operators to do their own pen testing, to do their red teaming exercises, and again, evidence to us. And that's another word that I'll stress slightly. We're not waiting for an incident for us to go and investigate what happened and take action. Actually, what we really want to do is, as we work through the measures, and you can see there's 250 plus measures that are there, we are monitoring them, so to speak, over a period of years, and we work through each one of those. So we will ask the operators individually to demonstrate evidence to us what they have done to meet that requirement. And similarly, network testing is in the same boat. What have they done to test the individual parts of the network, or the system of systems in the network? And pen testing isn't always technical as well. You know, there are human and physical aspects to it too. But the red teaming is very important. So the operators do that themselves internally. We would expect that, and we continue to do the pen testing program with NCSC. With that, and then equipment testing as well. Secure by design, of course. Anyone who's been to Cyber UK this week, you will have seen that phrase and heard that phrase quite a bit. And of course, we've seen it being driven in many places. And that's somewhere we take a view on in terms of telecom standards. So encouraging that secure by design, secure by default. So we need the vendor community to provide the operators with the solutions that they need, so that the equipment and the solutions that they implement in the networks actually meet the requirements as far as they possibly can. And that's really important. So that secure by design, we don't want to see situations where the operator has to add other compensating controls because they weren't able to meet some of the secure by design principles. That will take time. You know, there's a relatively long piece of work to do that, because there's quite an existing state of infrastructure out there. The code of practice does set out that providers have to assess the security of their network equipment. So there is an obligation now to do that. It's not just buy and install and run, and factoring security in as a core part of the procurement process. So this starts to drive different behaviors, and behavior is another one of our favorite words, because that's what we're doing. We're trying to change the behavior of the general ecosystem. Operators are the ones kind of at the front door of all of this, but you know, there's a lot more in the background with the vendors, with the standards standards bodies, and we do have to make sure that everyone moves along at the same time. Maintaining the security of the equipment through the life cycle. Again, I can't believe we have to write this down at times, but we do. It has to be there. So when procurement is done, there needs to be a commitment that the equipment will be secured and supported and patched effectively throughout its life cycle. And Pete mentioned earlier the UK Telecoms Lab, UKTL, so we are looking forward to this coming online very soon, but that will be a good, safe place to do sensible security test and measurement. It's and definitely it will be an area where lots of learning can come, and hopefully we'll start to validate quite a few of the concerns and dare I say it, that influence back into the ecosystem. So not necessarily directly to an operator, because that's not what we're immediately trying to. We're trying to that rising tide lifting all boats. Next slide, please. And finally, the most exciting one is reporting security compromises, and there is always a tension with this one, but it's now a mandatory obligation for providers to report security compromises to Ofcom. So we have had a public consultation on this, and obviously gone through the feedback. There are internal processes that every operator will have when dealing with security compromises and what I mean. So we do expect to see quite a few more I suppose reports than we would have had in the past, let me put it that way. And I expect NCSC and Ofcom will receive reports differently at times, I think, but there is absolutely a legal obligation now on the operators to report those compromises. And one of those, I'll just call it out for what it is, it doesn't necessarily mean a negative effect or a damage or data has been exfiltrated in order for that to happen. It can absolutely be the case that it's what we would call a pre-positioning attack, where somebody, malicious actor, has logged in, logged out again, but the very fact that that was able to happen, so potential harm could have occurred. We do absolutely expect to see things like that reported to us. So I'll close off here, Patrick, and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jerry. So if I could go to the next slide as well, please. So I'm going to give us an update of around some of the other regulatory initiatives around the world. If we could move to the next slide. So I'm going to frame the re-regulation of cybersecurity in the telecom sector as re-regulation 2.0. Yes, it's a little hackneyed as phrases go, but I think we are seeing what is a pretty seismic change in the way telecom security is being regulated all around the world. I think it started with banning untrusted vendors like Huawei, but it's now going, I think, much, much further, as not just the UK, but these other examples I'll share with you just now will show. Peter and Jerry have given us the fundamentals of the UK. I'll show in the next few slides that the UK is by no means alone in driving change, and I'll show that other governments are following suit. So next slide. As part of that, we're going to hop across the English Channel and take a look at what's going on in the EU. We'll then hop across the Atlantic for a look at what's going on in Canada and the US. We'll swing back towards Asia-Pac for a look at what's happening in India and Australia. These aren't the only countries where there are clearly major drives to make cybersecurity regulation of the telecom sector more stringent. These are just a handful of examples. They just happen to be somewhat prominent. Next slide. So in the EU, I'm going to focus on three elements of the regulatory framework as it affects daily telecom security operations. There are other aspects of legislation. The EU is a highly complex beast from a regulatory perspective. I've chosen to focus on these three. There are others that are relevant, but I'm just going to focus on these three in the interest of time. The 2018 European Electronic Communications Code, the EECC, revises the entire legislative framework for electronic communications. At the time it was written, it aimed to codify all existing EU telecoms regulatory regimes into one legal instrument. The 5G security toolbox of 5G risk mitigation measures was published just over 3 years ago. It provides recommended actions around restricting or excluding high-risk vendors and ensuring 5G vendor supply diversity. It also provides recommendations for strengthening the security requirements that national regulatory authorities can impose on mobile network operators. The NIS2 directive came into force recently. It is the centerpiece of cybersecurity legislation for the EU, as I understand it. Next slide. So where are we with adoption of this legislation? So in the case of the EECC, a number of member states have adopted it. Estonia was a very early adopter with its 2018 Cybersecurity Act. Among the requirements laid down by law are that a service provider is required to, for example, prepare a system risk assessment in which they shall set out a list of risks affecting the security of the system and the continuity of the service, determine the severity of consequences of a cyber incident occurring upon the realization of risks, and describe the measures for resolving a cyber incident. Ensure the existence and timeliness of a documented system risk assessment. Ensure the monitoring of the system for detecting actions or software compromising its security, and communicate information about the actions or software compromising the security of the system to the Estonian Information System Authority. And lastly, take measures for reducing the impact and spread of a cyber incident. Next slide, please. Germany implemented the EECC via the Telekommunikationsmodernierungsgesetz, or TKMOG, as I prefer to call it, and in fact they call it that in Germany too, by the way. There is a loose parallel of sorts between the UK's Telecom Security Act and the Company Code of Practice, and the TKMOG and the accompanying catalogue of security requirements, which runs to around 70 pages. Let's look at some of the language from this extract of the catalogue of security requirements. The obligated companies must implement a procedure for defining and handling any kind of security incident, including reporting it to responsible persons and authorities. Regular checks should be carried out to determine whether the specified procedure corresponds to the current circumstances and whether the actual implementation is in accordance with the planning. Suitable personnel must be available and appointed in the event of security incidents. The personnel should not only be trained to identify security incidents, but also taught how to specifically handle them. Critical security incidents must always be investigated. The investigation and results must be documented in a report. The report should indicate which measures have been taken or planned to avoid similar security incidents and their effects in the future. The measures taken or planned in this regard should be justified. An important point to make here, though, in terms of the rate of adoption of the EECC by EU member states, Germany and Estonia were leaders, early adopters, well out in front of other countries. I believe I'm right in saying, for example, that Ireland only adopted the EECC into law earlier this year, some 5 years after Estonia did. Next slide, please. So to the 5G security toolbox, as I mentioned, this provides recommended actions, including strengthening the security requirements for mobile operators via the national regulatory agencies of individual member states. Here's one of the technical mitigations recommended, Technical Measure 5, ensuring secure 5G network management, operation, and monitoring. Looking at the text here again, operators should provide clear visibility in network management and operations. They should implement effective network monitoring of at least all the critical components and sensitive part of 5G networks to detect anomalies and threats, such as threats to the 5G core coming from the compromised devices. Perhaps not highly prescriptive at a highly granular level, but certainly prescriptive nonetheless. Are EU member states paying any attention to the recommendations of the 5G security toolbox, which is an important question? According to the NIST Corporation group that was responsible for putting the toolbox together, the answer is yes. As of July 2020, in the green there, they reckon 6 member states had already strengthened the role and powers of the regulatory authorities in line with the Toolbox Strategic Measure 1. I don't have any actual information on this, but I would think leading countries such as Germany and Estonia are quite likely to be among those 6, according to this estimation. As I mentioned, the centerpiece of cybersecurity legislation as it affects telecom operators thus far, in my understanding, is the NIS2 directive. NIS2 came into force at the beginning of this year. Member states have until October 2024 to transpose it into national law. Relative to the original NIS1, NIS2 expands the coverage of the legislation to more entities, although that doesn't affect the telecom sector much, as telcos were already covered by NIS1. The big change for telcos and other entities covered under NIS2 is how prescriptive the new law is with respect to what telcos should do and how they should do it. In the case of incident management and incident reporting, for example, NIS2 sets out in detail what should be reported and within what specific time frame for each phase of a cybersecurity incident, from an incident being first identified, to first reported on, to finally conclusively reported on after the recovery phase. Today, many telcos in the EU have a mix of formal, informal, and indeed, in some cases, non-existent relationships in place with one another for coordinating responses to cyber incidents. NIS2 codifies this. It prescribes processes and mandates in law that there must be greater collaboration, including between telcos and authorities in different member states. Similarly to the UK's Telecommunications Security Act, the NIS2 directive provides for substantial fines for failure to comply with requirements. However, the maximum fines that a national regulator can impose under NIS2 are capped at 2% of turnover, of an operator's turnover, not the 10% ceiling as laid out in the UK, and I'm sure we'll come to ask Jerry about that later. If we go to Canada, we find that the Canadian government is looking to push through amendments to that country's Telecommunications Act. When you read legal reviews of it online, it's interesting that the parallels seem to be drawn most closely with the EU's NIS2. As shown on the left, Part 1 of the Act mandates that a telecommunications service provider must develop a security plan, conduct assessments to identify cybersecurity vulnerabilities, mitigate any vulnerabilities, and implement specific standards. Part 2 of the legislation is the Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act, the CCSPA, which covers a number of critical sectors of industry, including the telecom sector. The CCSPA mandates that an operator that's covered by the Act must identify and manage any organizational cybersecurity risks, including risks associated with the operator's supply chain and its use of third-party products and services, protect its critical systems from being compromised, detect any cybersecurity incidents affecting or having the potential to affect its critical systems, and minimize the impact of cybersecurity incidents affecting critical cyber systems. One very marked difference between the Canadian and both UK and EU legislation is that, as I understand it, the Canadian government has in mind capping fines at a mere 10 million Canadian dollars for a first offence and 15 million Canadian dollars for a second offence. Considerably lighter touch regulation from that perspective. And the next slide. You might think that over in the United States, they're perhaps less keen on government becoming increasingly prescriptive about how private sector organizations should protect themselves and their customers from cyber attacks. Well, you'd be wrong. In fact, there has been a very steady stream of potentially high-impact cybersecurity regulation coming out of Washington in the last few months, impacting the telecom and other sectors. There's last year's Critical Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, or CIRCIA. The SEC, the Security Exchanges Commission, is even bringing forward new cybersecurity rules, including incident reporting requirements for public companies. This based on the principle, as the SEC sees it, that investors are entitled to have some baseline information about a company's cybersecurity stance when deciding whether or not to buy or sell shares in them. Next slide. CERCIA and the SEC rules don't actually impact the telecom sector much at all. From an incident reporting perspective, the FCC already requires telecom operators to notify the authorities in the event of a breach of Customer Proprietary Network Information, or CPNI. That's the network and network service information that all carriers generate about customers during the course of using their network services. However, and this is extremely relevant to today's discussion, the FCC announced in January this year via a new notice of proposed rulemaking that it wants to update those breach notification rules for American telcos. Next slide. The public consultation is ongoing as we speak. As you'd expect, the proposal is encountering a full and frank exchange of views from interested stakeholders, including the carriers themselves, regarding how an incident should be defined. Whether, for example, a requirement to report can or should be tied to some objective criteria of probable harm caused. The fundamental takeaway here, though, the US is by no means above the fray here. The US government is very much aligned with trends elsewhere in the world in terms of wanting to turn to more stringent regulation to drive up cybersecurity standards in the telecom sector as well as other sectors. Next slide, please. Over to the other side of the world and to India now. The Indian government, via the Department of Telecommunications, the DOT, publishes a number of what it calls Indian Telecommunications Security Assurance Requirements, or ITSARs. These are addressing more and more aspects of the way Indian telcos are expected to deploy and operate cybersecurity. To give just one recent example, a couple of months ago, the draft of a new ITSAR was released. This prescribes how India's operators are expected to implement security related to network functions virtualization, NFV, in mobile network architectures, including the cloud-native 5G network. The document is highly detailed and highly prescriptive. When we do a rewind or a replay of this webinar, I think the word prescriptive will be the one that occurs most frequently. This document runs to 170 pages on this subject matter alone. There's an extract here showing the requirements as they relate to the security of software images. Each of those bullets begins, images must, or image registries must. No ifs or buts, it's all about the must. Next slide. Lastly, let's take a look at Australia. You may recall that in September last year, Optus, the country's second largest telco, disclosed that it had suffered a large-scale data breach. It resulted in the exposure of the personally identifiable information, the PII, of nearly 10 million current and former Optus customers. That left them open to identity theft and fraud, especially the 2.8 million of them whose exposed data went beyond birth dates, home addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses to include passport and driver's license numbers. It wasn't just that the hack had major and far-reaching consequences, it was also clear from Optus's response that its incident response planning had been inadequate. Next slide. I can't tell you when Australia will pass new cybersecurity legislation, nor what that legislation will contain. Actually, neither can anyone, because they really are at the very formative stages of defining a new strategy and the legal framework to support it. What we do know is that the Optus breach created a very big public outcry in Australia and that the government is intent on legislating. When it came to trying to use the country's existing legislation in the aftermath of the Optus breach, Minister for Cybersecurity Claire O'Neill called the available legislation bloody useless. She said voluntary measures will not get Australia where we need to be, and has been consistent in advocating a legislative overhaul since. A few weeks ago, her office released a discussion paper on a new national cybersecurity strategy, appointing an expert advisory board to advise on what that strategy should look like. If you have any doubt how centrally the telecom sector is likely to feature in the legislation that arises from this effort, then the fact that she has appointed as chair of that advisory board Andrew Penn, the former CEO of Telstra, should dispel any of those doubts. Next slide, please. Hopefully, this handful of examples is enough to demonstrate that what we're seeing is a global movement towards more stringent regulation of the telecom sector in different markets around the world. What does it look like in summary? I submit to you that it looks something like the following. We started with a global baseline where, of course, regulators have always had some level of expectations of telcos as regards cybersecurity. We've seen that updated with bans on the use of untrusted network equipment vendors. That seems to be something of a baseline now. I think the global trend we're seeing is of governments being increasingly demanding with respect to cybersecurity outcomes. And in the case of a small subset, like some of the countries we've talked about, we're seeing governments being increasingly prescriptive. I do think this is a global trend. Wherever your own country sits on this chart, I think the trajectory is almost certainly one heading from the top to the bottom of this graphic, albeit with differing strategies, differing priorities, tactics, carrots and sticks, and over different timeframes. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, yes, this is just a shameless plug. If you would care to, if you've enjoyed today's session, you're very welcome to join us for HardenStance's Telecom Threat Intelligence Summit in June 6 and 7, www.hardenstance.com for that. After that shameless plug, we can move on. Thank you. And of course, yes, how we would like to move on, of course, is Nils. You've been sitting patiently, listening to the three of us say our thing. Nils, how would you like to respond to what you've heard from Jerry, Peter, and myself? What are the takeaways? What are the key messages you take from this, and you'd like to impart on our audience?
So, first of all, I found also the poll you did at the Mobile World Congress quite interesting for me. Of course, also the last bullet was nice, helpful, because if new regulation will secure budget, the fight for budget is more or less always there, and security sometimes more or less loses this, and with a new regulation there will be. But also the second bullet, which was regardless of regulation, I think telcos will go the direction anyway, has quite some truth in it. And then bringing this into more or less the linkage to what Peter and Gary was mentioning, that telcos have a very, very high more or less exposure attack surface, that they have quite some crown jewels, and that they more or less have a lot of legacy plus very, very new technology, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. And then looking at the amount of incident, I think they are doing a decent job. So of course, I think there's more to do, and as such, the end of laisser-faire, as this more or less webinar is named, might be applied. I think we need to improve, especially considering that new services based on 5G will be the backbone of economies and countries. So as such, regulators need to be now part of this team play, as also Gary and Peter said. And I think this is this word team play is probably something which is quite important for me, because for me, I think it is important that the operators, the regulators, the suppliers, and the advisors who bring out these services, which then will be used by a lot of subscribers, but also companies, factories, whatsoever, that we need to work together, because only if we work as a team we can achieve best results. We can bundle our energy, our forces, and that also means, because coming to what you were just sharing, Patrick, the regulation, even if there are similarities, that one looks to the other, it will be important that there will be not only similarities, but we come to a kind of best practice. When we see there a code of practice for the UK or EU toolbox, it will be difficult for suppliers, but also for companies, operators, if they are in multiple countries, to do risk management. If they have at one time look only with their left eye and the other time with their right eye, I think we need to help to make this applicable. And I think that's where I think the team play of then companies like Nokia, the regulators like Ofcom and CSC, but also others, and then the users, Vodafone, BT, Sky, just to name some, would be very, very necessary.
Is that the sum of the comments you want to make for now, Nils?
Oh, that's, I think, the first one, which was important to really stress out, that we really need to align, that we need to.
Okay. Do you want to come to the other couple subsequently?
Sure.
Okay, sure. So I guess before I turn over to Jerry and Peter, which I will, I have just an immediate response to your. So when you talk about the need for regulatory alignment, what is the forum? What is the venue for achieving that these days? And actually, is there not a case for actually saying, the folks that actually see most of this at a global level are actually the vendors, oddly enough, like Nokia?
I would say no. The thing, especially, and then when we also come to risk management and security monitoring, which is nowadays part of many new upcoming regulation, if this is being executed, most should be seen by the operators. Then, of course, in conjunction, if there is a kind of incident report or a breach report, the regulators as well, then the suppliers who support, because they are the subject matter expert. So I think in the end, the initial visibility should be with those who have the incident or the breach.
Right. Okay. So Jerry, Peter, regulatory convergence. Do you agree with Nils's point? Do you understand it? Do you agree with it? And how do we go about achieving it?
Well, an ideal world would, as long as the regulations were.
We don't live in an ideal world, Jerry?
Yeah. Well, well, here we are. We have regulators. You wouldn't need a regulator in an ideal world, but
right.
No. Well. Convergence is one thing. I think every different countries and nations, of course, because it tends to be a national regulation, to sometimes have a different view of what the risk is as well, and right. that does change. But I think there are challenges in having. Not everyone's going to see it exactly the same way, and there will always be internal influences and what needs to be done. But I certainly think there is a baseline. I think there's a really good example of that in the code of practice. Dare I say it? If you look at a number of the different countries that you presented earlier, Patrick, quite a few of the intentions behind it are very similar. So there's a good degree of overlap. They're just written slightly differently, and in fairness to Nils, I get that point. They look different, but sometimes they're asking the same thing in a different way. I think what we're doing here is twofold. The first one, giving some sort of baseline consistency, and yes, we are slightly pushing ahead of the curve on that one. Giving some sort of consistency into the operational model, not just what the vendor needs to do. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just what you buy that's important, it's how you implement it, how you can do it, you operate it over the long term. So hopefully that will change. And secondly, I think, to your point, Patrick, a lot of this can be driven by the vendors, and that may well be the case in the standards bodies, because that's definitely where there's a lot of influence, and that's where secure by default almost starts. So getting it driven in there, a lot of the heavy influence in that respect can be from the vendor community, and supplier community. So having a good meeting of minds on that's where we start to drive consistency, but almost not by default or by accident, but it comes out the other end in something that meets the requirements, even though they are maybe articulated differently in national regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think we need convergence. I think that is the direction we've got to look at it. I think, in the end, governments are responsible for looking after their digital infrastructure, for looking after their citizens, and that is the focus. And I think there's been a lot of alarm recently at the scale of some of the compromises. But I do think we need to focus on convergence. And I'll be honest, in the code of practice, where there were suitable standards from the GSMA or from 3GPP or elsewhere at ETSI, that those documents are referenced from the code of practice. Reality is, though, much of what's in the code of practice was not already written down, and so it needed written down. But I do think we need to do that convergence, and I think it needs to be in collaboration between governments and also between governments and industry to achieve it.
Thanks very much. So just before we come back to you, Nils, thank you to the gentleman who pointed out that the 5G security toolbox is apparently, according to this gentleman, adopted in the Dutch legislation. I don't know if that gentleman is in fact a regulatory person or not, but anyway, he says that is the case, so it's so good to hear. So now let's go back to Nils. Other couple of points you might want to make about the first part of the discussion.
The second point, which we just touched upon again, I think what is necessary is that we have good and clear guidelines, or as it was now called, code of practice. And of course, this code of practice, if possible, should be then linked to what the users, in most of the cases, the operators are used to, like the 3GPP standards. It was mentioned earlier that the code of practice speaks about how to secure the control plane end-to-end. So anybody familiar with 3GPP, there are certain TS technical specifications which give also their guidance, but of course in the 3GPP they more or less define what kind of protocols are available, can be used, so that interoperability is guaranteed across the globe, wherever you are. But how to best apply this, and there is in quite some room for interpretation. So I think what is then helpful if, once again, in a teamwork, the suppliers, the regulators, the operators define a best code of practice, best blueprints, that will also help us in regard to the second dimensions, what was also mentioned, the operation, which means we need to come to a continuous risk assessment, risk management, monitoring, assurance, or incident detection. And we can only do this if we are giving them out clear guidance and don't leave too much room for interpretation as much as possible.
Gents, you were in the business of writing these regulations and making the communications around them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I can't argue. It's as clear as possible is important. Having been through the process, achieving both clarity and ensuring all the lawyers and all the processes that need to be put in place are also satisfied is challenging. And so you always end up with a bit of translation layer between what is expected and required from a cybersecurity point of view and what can actually be written into legislation. So it isn't always possible, and I suspect that translation is going to be different in different countries. And I think it goes back to Jerry's point that the intent behind what we're seeing going on around the world is often quite similar. However, that process of translation into legislation can end up with things looking different in different places, and so I recognize the challenge there, and I suppose I again would say it is beneficial if more of this is written down in standards documents and equivalent type things, because then that means that each government can then just reference it rather than having to translate these things into their own legislation. They can reference it as part of their legislation. So I do think that is worth considering. But yeah, again, I appreciate the challenge. We did try our absolute best to be as clear as possible. That was clearly one of our intents, is to make what is expected on the operators, because ultimately, success from my point of view is the UK operators being more secure. That's what it's about, and so obviously we recognise that clarity is needed in order to help them do that.
Do you have anything to add, Jerry?
Yeah, I think that what we're not trying to do here is have an audit process where we're ticking boxes. What we are trying to do is change the behaviour of the ecosystem and the behavioural aspects of the ecosystem, and that's operators, that's vendors, so that people understand truly what they're doing and why, rather than simply ticking a box or outsourcing it in a contractor. So there's a really important aspect about, dare I say, competency development and understanding one's own network and systems. And with that, we start to see we don't have the statements like, "I don't understand what you mean in the code of practice," and it is really quite clear, I have to say, and it's going to take a bit of time there, but I definitely think that's the key objective here. We're trying to change that behaviour and competence and help develop competencies in that area, and that will filter out. So it's not just the UK. Hopefully, that rising tide lifting all boats. Other nations, other regulators, other information assurance agencies asking the same types of questions means that it becomes more ubiquitous and easier all around.
Yeah, and it's unavoidable that some measures are going to be somewhat subjective, but for the most part, we really tried to write measures that could be tested by a computer. And so ultimately, I hope sometime down the line, there will be automated processes which are verifying that a network is still compliant with, let's say, 90% of what is required from a legislative point of view, because obviously for everyone's sake, that makes networks more efficient and it makes overseas-sited networks easier.
Right. And by the way, thank you everybody for your questions. We have a pile of questions that have accumulated. We've answered one or two already, but do please keep them coming. Nils, did you have one more point you wanted to make?
One more point regarding also what you touched upon with a follow-up question, Patrick. Who sees more or less what most, and how can more or less then there be a good teamwork? So coming to more or less the risk monitoring, the incident detection, reporting. Once again, nobody is eager to more or less be put on a stand, but I believe we only can improve if we know how to respond, and then if it's trusted and that everybody starts to share when something is ongoing. So if someone like Nokia then helps an operator to develop an incident detection response with certain workflows, it would be good to really, once again, work as a team with regulators who then in the end are the perceiving units and who have quite some power to more or less give some penalties. It is, I think, necessary here in a fair teamwork to work on these incident detection, threat intelligence systems, and come there to once again this teamwork else it will be very, unbalanced.
If I may, I did actually look at threat intelligence sharing within the telecom ecosystem a couple of years ago, and it was quite staggering how poor it is, in the sense that even within the same telecom organization, you have different groups accumulating their own databases in different formats within the same telco, let alone between the telcos in the same country, let alone between telcos in other countries. So, fellas, how do you see the UK legislative environment helping to foster better sharing of information, better threat intelligence sharing? Because on a scale of 1 to 10 today, I mean, I don't think we're at much more than a 2 or 3. I don't think it's unkind to put it that bluntly, is it?
Yeah, I think we're a long way behind where the wider cybersecurity sector is. I think that's absolutely right. I think, when you look at the amount of conversations and the amount of automated sharing that is now happening in all sorts of different cybersecurity sectors, we're not there. And there aren't the communities yet that are sharing this, at least not that I'm aware of, in an automatic way and are making sure the data is available. I think it's really important that does start to happen. It is actually one of the requirements within the code of practice is that operators, actually I think it's above that, actually I think it's a regulatory requirement for operators to communicate to other operators when they think that there is information they need to be aware of in relation to a breach, compromise, that sort of thing. And so that there's actually an expectation now, a legal requirement on operators to talk to one another about cybersecurity. So at least that's a step forward. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight there's a long way to go.
Yeah, interesting comment in the chat, in the webinar chat, by the way, from Silke Holtmans, a former colleague of yours, Nils. She is at, I think she's at PwC these days, if I'm not mistaken. She makes an interesting point. The baseline exists today via MITRE, Fight 5G, that framework, but it is pretty new, not yet widely used. To call it pretty new is almost an understatement, I think, isn't it, Silke? It's brand new, like fresh out the oven. So absolute baseline, interesting, but to your point, a very long way to go. Gents, did you want to respond to Neil's comments yourselves?
Just to
I'm sorry, Gary,
just to build on Silke's comment, 5G, but remember, telecoms is a system of systems and a network of networks.
Yep.
And there are many fixed line networks, pure data networks, GSM, and at times other things as well. And they all interoperate with each other. So yes, we may have the fight as a baseline for 5G, but we still have a lot of other aspects to cover, secure, and defend effectively. So I think a lot of the focus has been on 5G. What we're trying to do is lift the security of the telecom ecosystem more generally. And yes, some of it can be relatively old, and you will hear different phrases varying between legacy and heritage. But it doesn't mean it's not important. It just means it's been around a while. It may have been designed at a time when threats were understood differently, but we're in a different day today, and we need to make sure that they are defended as effectively as they possibly can.
Okay, and yeah, did you want to come back with some of your own comments here, fellas, relative to what Nils said?
I don't think any more, actually. I think that was covered. Well, I think from my point of view.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Then, if I may, I'm going to crack on with some of the questions that I had in mind for you. I will come to audience questions. Please don't feel you're being ignored. You're not. I will come to your questions shortly, but a couple I wanted to go with here. In terms of the UK Act, gentlemen, and I'll put this to Nils as well in the broader context. How broadly applicable is it? For example, does it take in unlicensed telecom networks? Does it take in satellite communications, for example, or is it more or entirely terrestrially based?
So there is some clarity on that question, and if it is a public electronic communications network or service, so and public is one of the key points there, then it does fall into scope. So that is if you are a business, very generally speaking. It's not legal advice, but if you are a business or a human and you can buy that service of the operator, then it falls into scope.
Very good. And sorry, Nils, is that what you're seeing elsewhere in the world? Other industry, we weren't going to go there, were we? Did you want to add anything on that, or are you good?
So I cannot currently comment in regard to the regulator.
Right.
What I can say is that Nokia more or less will cover these different sectors, different more or less technology areas, similar like also the usual operators. So we have our security processes which we apply. We have the standard security which we follow as such, and we also help, for example, some of the satellite communication providers in regards to their risk assessments for certain areas.
Right. So, Jerry, a question for you here. When we first started talking about doing this webinar a couple of months back, in the space of a few sentences, I think I used the word compliance 3 times. And I felt as though I may as well have insulted a member of your family with the use of that word. You know, the philosophy of what you guys are doing is about security assurance and explicitly not compliance. What is the black and white? What is it about security compliance that you want to get away from? And what is security assurance, and how is that fundamentally different?
So I think I used one of the words earlier, which was behaviors. We're trying to change the behavior of the ecosystem generally, and the one that we do regulate directly is the operators. But we do need the support of the other parts of the standardization, the vendors and supplier community as well. To drive a compliant regime in an area as complex as this is not necessarily going to deliver the right result. Ticking the box today, the threat changes tomorrow, that does not mean the operator is secure. So the important thing is not to be driving to a point where something is delivered and everyone feels the job is done. Actually, it's a continuous process of understanding what the threats are and making sure they are mitigated effectively, commensurate with the regulations and the code of practice. And that's why we can't give a certificate of compliance in inverted commas, because that's not what we're aiming to do. Actually, what we're aiming to see is demonstrable understanding of how to manage the risk.
And there's a question that's actually come in. I'm going to touch on this one that's come in from the from somebody in the audience. It's relevant to this particular question I've asked. Asking the following question for a gentleman from F5: what is the relation between Ofcom's quote-unquote assess the security of network equipment and GSMA's NESAS program? As in, will Ofcom's UK Act also require that 5G network equipment is NESAS certified?
Well, to the last question, no, we aren't asking for NESAS certification. There is a vendor security assessment document that is included as part, if you see the flow in the code of practice, that's an NCSC document. It gives an excellent view of the types of questions that we expect to be asked of the supplier community or the vendor community, and that deals with, there's quite a bit of overlap, dare I say it, with many of the aspects that we see in NESAS, but we're not asking for a certificate. We may see some of these inputs copied and pasted from vendors, and I expect that we will see some of that, but that's not what we are requiring. It's subtly different and quite a bit more.
Yeah, if I jump in on that one, the certification processes, I mean, it's something that the NCSC used to do a lot. We used to do a lot of certification on the commercial level. And what we found when we actually looked at the outcome, the reality of that certification is often the certificated products were less secure than the uncertificated ones. And ultimately what's happening when you're certificating is you're transferring the risk from the people who actually own it, the people who produce the product, to the labs that are doing the certification. And you're basically putting a cap on the amount of effort that is put into that cybersecurity. They do the work to meet the certificate and then they're done. What we do still certificate is capability. So we will still say this is a good pen test company, and you'll still see that on the NCSC website. You know, this is a company that can do pen tests. They have people who know what they're doing. And so what we're really looking for, and where we're going when it comes to vendor equipment, is we want to do attacker-led testing. So we want to attack equipment as our adversaries would attack the equipment. And we believe that, you know, if people all around the world start doing this, if the UK does it, Japan does it, and the US, then that would give me a lot more confidence that that is a good product from a security point of view. If lots of different good groups around the world have had a go at breaking it, then that's where you get confidence for, in our opinion, around product security. And that's not really where NISAS is. And NISAS is focused far more on ensuring that the SCAS specifications are met, which they should be anyway, for any product shouldn't be released if it's not meeting that level of baseline. And also that they evaluate over 4 days the paperwork that a vendor has in relation to cybersecurity. And so neither of those we think are actually going to make the tangible difference that is required around product security.
Another question here, if I may. When you look at all of the very public hacks of telecom operators that there have been in the last few years, Peter, you showed a few in the US just in the last few weeks. There was Optus. Frequently, these attacks are not on the actual. It's not the telecom network that a telco gets hacked. It's the office IT. So my question for you is, you know, is the office IT domain of a telco covered by the Telecom Security Act? And if it isn't, why not? Would it not be appropriate for the two to be regulated holistically rather than separately?
So, in short, if you can affect the operations and the security assurance of the telecoms network, that through an attack on the office network or the office IT network, yes, it's absolutely in scope. And we expect to see evidence that it is appropriately defended in order to prevent that from happening.
Very good. Okay. Then I'm going to start taking some questions here because I want to finish it on the hour. We've got another 12 minutes. First question: do you think the Cyber Resilience Act is going to impact telcos in the EU? Anybody have any thoughts on that? EU Cyber Resilience Act. Anybody familiar with it? Is it going to have a big impact? If nobody has strong views, we can move on. That's no problem. We're going to move on.
Have a strong view. Yeah, I think we move on. Yeah.
Okay, no worries.
I think it would be remiss of us to comment on that one in some ways. Yeah.
So next question: how are internet-based communications such as direct or instant messaging covered, presumably under the UK Act? Internet-based communications like direct or instant messaging or streaming, are they covered?
This is focused on the telecoms aspect, so to speak. So, not if they don't meet the definition of a public electronic communication service or network, no, they don't.
Right, very good. Okay, let's write. Operators are somewhat used. If you guys are looking down the questions, I'm going down a bit. Operators are somewhat used to this type of regulation operation. Where new operating models are being looked at, e.g. edge cloud, do you expect this to cause either a slowdown in deployment or disincentive to the UK telcos in these traditional suppliers? I'm ever so sorry. I don't understand what that fellow's asking. Do you? I thought that was going to be a good question. I have no idea where that one's going. I'm going to move straight on from that. Some of these are small tones rather than questions, which is very flattering in some respects, but difficult to deal with. A question for Jerry. Thank you for sharing the view of the TSA. You made a point about performing continuous audit and assessment. Should there be a need to define a minimum baseline that operators have to achieve in order to be considered safe and resilient? I understand there is no silver bullet, but setting up minimum baseline will help operators and regulators understand the risk maturity. That sounds like a principle that's embedded in what you've done, does it not?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's exactly what the regulations and the code of practice will deliver. I think, again, I think if the question is alluding to, do we have a set of tick boxes that will kind of certify at the end, you get 85%, you've got an A and you're good to go? That's not what we're looking for. Actually, we're looking for evidence of understanding and behavioral change.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we've had the push on both directions of we're being over prescriptive and we're not being prescriptive enough,
Right.
and that's from industry and industry pushing in both directions, right? That's not elsewhere, and that's linked to the I need to persuade my seniors that I need to do this, and I know I need to do it, but I need you to write down that I need to do it, and that just to me suggests a culture failure, and again, like I said at the beginning, I understand where that's come from, but it's something we need to change.
Right. Back to one of the questions I wanted to ask. So I think I mentioned the Canadians are looking at fining carriers, I think it's 10 or 15 million Canadian dollars for non-compliance. The NIS directive puts a ceiling of 2%. Over here in the UK, you guys are sticking a 10% ceiling. Jerry, you've got one hell of a lot of power there. What's that all about? Why so high of a ceiling?
It's an ideal incentive, isn't it, to deliver on the objective? It's not axiomatic that it would be 10%, of course, and it just means that the ceiling is sufficiently high to ensure it gets the attention it does. And actually, it has really helped. It's not just a case of operators now needing to comply, because of course that and to deal with the Telecom Security Act, it's it's an enabler as well to do the investment that's required in order to deliver on the objective in the first place. So it's no longer a competition between will I invest in security or will I invest in a new marketing scheme or product or something. It really helps the security parts of the operator invest effectively and hopefully efficiently. But yeah, 10% is the headline figure. That's very exciting. There's an element of we don't want to get to that point. We actually want to change the behavior of all the networks so that we don't have to do that. So a success for us is not having to go to enforcement action and is working proactively with the operators.
So maybe rather than saying it's very exciting, you maybe want to say it's a dramatic headline, because I think the idea that it's very exciting is perhaps not the word you want to use. Okay. A great question.
I think maybe it's not so much about Monis really playing that card. Important for me is when I read some of the regulations and other things is that really what also was stressed out. We need to come to a behavior and culture, and we need to really Monis start to bring security to the next level. As such, what I read in certain countries that to a certain degree cyber security insurance are now provided in certain areas, which ensures that instead of more or less just putting something into the bank, there is really some improvements. So of course, it's nice to have the card. Important is just money to play it in right.
Yeah. So a question here from Ian Ronayne. Hi, Jerry. The UK Act is live now. Great question. What are the top 3 real-world challenges you're seeing coming out of implementation?
Yeah, that's great to get a top 3 question when you haven't actually prepared. But I would say, I think three, obviously 3 things. So driving that behavioral change into the ecosystem, that's going to be a real challenge. So it's not. It may appear, that 10% figure tends to concentrate people on the enforcement aspect. That's the last, station in the journey, so to speak. Actually, what we're trying to do is change the behavior aspect. So that proactive understanding, that's not necessarily natural for a regulator. Regulators tend to are viewed as people who turn up at the end. Actually, we're here right at the very beginning, and we're very keen to do that. So that's going to be difficult, not just for the operators, but also for the regulators and the cybersecurity agencies. Scale is another challenge. So the actual scale of doing the monitoring and the assessment is really quite significant. And I know many of my operator colleagues and friends will say it's an awful lot of work. And our response to that is yes, and we're the ones who are having to do the assessment of the results. So there's definitely a big scalability aspect and the complexity there too. So it's not just 5G, it's not just the fixed networks, it's also the other systems that could affect that as well. And understanding that, having those iterative discussions and understanding different vendors and how their products behave, etc. That's a challenge, not just for Ofcom, also for and with NCSC and the operators as well.
Let me just a couple of great questions further down here. One,
can I comment on
of course, Neil. Sorry, yeah, please.
On the three more or less challenges, what I see, similar to what was just mentioned. First of all, the assessment. Anybody needs to do now a proper risk assessment and monitoring. And once again, we come to all the legacy and this wide variety. There needs to be quite some expertise, and that is where several of the companies are currently struggling. Monitoring, as mentioned, it's not the scale from my perspective. Once again, you need to create a single pane of glass for all these technologies. Else, if you end up with 20 systems, you are not able to work with it. So, and last but not least, we are getting quite strict incident and breach timelines. That means all these systems need to really be connected to a system to more or less match these timelines. And that's going to be tremendous difficult, especially looking at the timelines the regulators say till when it should be up and running.
Right. I'm going to go to the next two questions here. First from Bob, the second from Eric in your question tab there, gents. The question from Bob is a very interesting one, I think. To the points on sharing, one of the biggest challenges I see globally is the rising cost of implementing and operating proper cybersecurity across entire ecosystems as threats increase. This gentleman, by the way, it works for a major software company. How do we work together beyond just information sharing to mitigate these rising costs as an industry, as there are not endless budgets? Sounds like security is starting to hit his bottom line a bit, and he's a bit cranky. Basically, as a vendor, if you're incurring more and more costs in terms of doing security properly, should you just swallow that on your bottom line, or are there ways that burden can be more equally distributed in some way?
So maybe I'll give a bit of an observation on this, which is time to market. The tension between time to market and designing a product really securely, there is a real tension there, and we do recognize that from the past. And if anything, this legislation and regulations are an enabler to that choice does not become a difficult one, because they ostensibly, if that piece of network equipment is to be sold in the UK, it has to meet a certain level of operational assurance. So I would hope that it's seen as an enabler here. Very often we find some of the complexities of securing infrastructure is because it wasn't built in terms of secure by default at the very start. And doing some of that upfront internal pen testing, good code reviews, building the features in properly, making sure that cryptographic assurance is done in the right way, all those sort of aspects, doing it up front saves time in the end. I think there are times where a shortcut is taken in order to meet the market requirements. And of course, operators drive that too, because they want it quickly and first as well. It's not just that the vendor wants it out there quickly. So I would hope that this helps remove some of that tension, and that other countries would follow in a similar way.
I'm just going to take one more question. In fact, there are two on the same subject at the end here, Eric, and then the one immediately underneath. And I'm going to go with I'm going to mention that, put the two together. The code of practice does refer to sharing threat intelligence among operators, but does not refer to a framework that will be used. There is no telecom threat sharing framework that exists for now, so won't that be a problem for operators? Question one. Allied to that, the one above from Eric, and this is a very interesting question. How can you share data from an operator perspective with a regulator when there's the threat of being fined by that same regulator? It may sound like a petty perspective, but it is seen as a threat. Those 2 points together, gentlemen, if you would. I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, so I think the point about there needs to be a threat sharing framework, absolutely right. Yeah, there does need to be a threat sharing framework, and it's something that we need to work together on to make sure that's put in place, and so that it is possible for operators to share information with each other efficiently and quickly when they need to. So and securely, of course. So yeah, I couldn't agree more that it is a piece of work that needs to be done, and we need to all work together to get that done. Do you want to take the regulator question, or shall I?
Yeah. So. The difference between threat and incident here. So threat sharing, I don't actually see as a significant issue. And honestly, we would expect that to happen. Yes, there is a natural tension in doing that with the regulator. And actually, that's in part why we have NCSC, because they are the national technical authority as well to advise on those. But in terms of threat sharing, we would expect to see that relatively equitably. In terms of incident, there is a tension, but of course, there is mandatory incident reporting as well, and that's a slightly different mechanism. Yeah. But I fully recognize the tension. There is I suppose, a maturity model that we're just embarking on it here, and there's going to be, I suppose, a trust relationship that already relatively mature in the UK, certainly between the operators and industry, and I would hope that we build on that and be pragmatic. Again, we are looking to be pragmatic, sensible, and make sure the incentives are there that people learn and understand what the issues are, as opposed to just seeing this as a tick box exercise.
Yeah, if I could jump in as well, I think it all comes down to maturity. I think if we can move to a different culture, then finding an incident is not the issue, right? Finding an incident is a moment of success. I know it never feels like it. It doesn't feel like it from the NCSC side when we're having to manage it, but it is, when you look back, the point of success. And so that, there is the threat of being fined by Ofcom. That threat exists anyway if you've not been doing the things you need to do. The point of, you're going to get fined because you found an incident, that isn't the reason you're going to get fined. And so that isn't the reason not to share with Ofcom or to try and avoid that bit of the legislation. We're all looking to act around this maturely. We're not expecting, and I've said this to many operators, that if you believe you will not get compromised, you're approaching this in the wrong way. You should assume you are compromised and that you're working your best to find those compromises in your networks. That is a far better way to go about this. And then when you take that mindset, then the fact that you found something is your moment of success, rather than assuming that finding something is the incident, is the incident in its own right, and that is the problem. It isn't.
Any closing remarks, Nils? Sorry, good. Any closing remarks on this matter, or are you good?
Being honest, as we would have to, we are not the operators. We don't have to submit the incidents. So interesting still is how can a secure data transfer enabled without then leading to negative impacts. So I think that is once again where the team working, what we discussed earlier, needs to be established in a community of trust.
And I'm going to close with this sort of concluding remark here. The conversation of the last couple of minutes, and it's also recurred once or twice throughout the session, is, I think, from the perspective of an operator, no matter what country they're in, there is a world of difference, or there can be a world of difference between reading bare bones text and actually meeting with your regulators, going actually meeting the individuals that are concerned, the people who are actually monitoring this, the actual individuals, getting to know who they are, having conversations, so that what you can actually contextualize what is written in stark text and have a more nuanced understanding of what it actually means from an operational standpoint. I think just going from the text and drawing conclusions exclusively from the text is a pretty unhelpful business for everybody, I would think. So I think with that, I'm going to thank everybody. I'm going to thank Nils, Jerry, Peter. Thank you so much for participating today. Thank you to our audience for some terrific questions. Sorry we couldn't get around to all of them, but that was just a function of the volume of them. Thank you very much indeed. I'm actually going to invite Ian and Ralph to show themselves. They have been spinning the wheels frantically behind the scenes whilst we've been enjoying ourselves up front. There's Ralph. Ralph works for St Albans Web Design. He is my partner in crime in assembling this session. And we also, I think, do we have Ian? Are you going to be able to show yourselves? There's Ian. There we go. So Ralph's company is staubanwebdesign.com. You can reach Ian through iandavis.co.uk. Thanks, guys, for putting on a tremendous show for us. Very much appreciated indeed. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope to see you next time at the Telecom Threat Intelligence Summit, June 6th, June 7th. Join us for that.